Hello and welcome to the election special of the Big Picture. Over the last few weeks, we at the Rajya Sabha TV have been taking up key issues which will be faced by the new government which will be in place next month and discussing them. This week we are looking at the issue of foreign policy and the challenges on this front which will be faced by the new government. In the last 10 years, the two UPA governments faced several challenges, whether it was the Indo-US nuclear deal, situation in Afghanistan, Sri Lanka, crisis in West Asia and the problems in the neighborhood, among others. The way it was dealt with has received mixed reactions. In a world which has changed quite a bit in this period, fresh challenges are bound to be faced as a new government takes office next month. What are likely to be these challenges and how should the new government tackle them? Should India be more proactive in various conflict situations across the world? How will the world react if there is a change in the political color of the new government? How much continuity in foreign policy is important in such circumstances? We will discuss all this today with an eminent panel of guests over the next 1 hour. I have with me a galaxy of distinguished former ambassadors, G. Parthasarathy, Meera Shankar, Vivek, Katju, and a distinguished academic and senior fellow at the Center for Policy Research, Prof. Baladas, Ghoshal. Welcome to all of you. Mr. Parthasarathy, I would like to come to you first. What are the key foreign policy challenges which the new government will face?
Let me before that put one thought to our audience. I think despite all the thunder and brimstone of an election campaign, there is a broad consensus on foreign policy. Two crucial issues have gone unnoticed.
Yes.
The support for Russia on Ukraine, the vote on the Sri Lankan resolution, both contentious, yet the BJP, amidst high-pitched rhetoric, did not criticize. These were national decisions taken in the national interest. I have been through several changes in government. There is a lot of difference in style, a little in substance, but happily in our parliamentary democracy, foreign and security policies enjoy a broad national consensus between national parties. I recall Mr. Vajpayee telling Mr. Gromyko once, he was very worried because Soviet Union had backed the emergency. And when Gromyko looked nervous, Mr. Vajpayee told him, Indo-Soviet relations do not depend on the political fate of any individual or political party. Now, I think by and large, that holds true. Yes, there can be differences in nuances, how you deal with a given situation, but by and large, in foreign policy, this has been a happy thing. If you talk to people in Parliament, you will find that perhaps on the Standing Committee on External Affairs, it's a much more relaxed atmosphere.
Absolutely. Like standing committees don't reflect what happens outside, unfortunately.
That's the point. I mean, you will have, it is inevitable that there will be people scoring debating points in an election, fair enough. But I think we should understand that in an ultimate analysis, there is a national consensus.
Mr. Katju, would you agree with that? Would you agree? And the kind of rhetoric we are observing in the election campaign, the kind of passion which is there in the election campaign. Do you subscribe to Mr. Parthasarathy's view?
Look, I do believe that interests are permanent. Let's go to basics. Interests are permanent. And if interests are permanent, then there is a certain consensus in the definition of these interests and the pursuit of these interests. But I'm fairly confident that if Mr. Modi were to come in, as is expected these days, then there will not only be a difference in nuance or style, but also in many areas of substance.
Why do you think so?
Because I think Mr. Modi will be a little more coherent and assertive when it comes especially to our western neighborhood.
No, Mr. Katju, one of the things which is being said about this man is that he has never had any experience in the center. He has been a state level leader. He comes with a completely different perspective. Do you think that perspective will be in the national interest?
No, I think you're being a little unfair.
I'm asking a question.
No, I know, but the question is, if you permit me to say, a little loaded.
It is that the debate has become loaded in this country.
The question is loaded because you are assuming that a person who's remained a chief minister doesn't have a national vision. After all, in the old days...
This was said when Mr. Devegowda became Prime Minister also.
No, in the old days, there were Congress chief ministers who came to the centre. Govind Ballabh Pant came to the centre. He showed a remarkable national vision. No one ever argued that Govind Ballabh Pant didn't have a national vision. So I doubt whether it is valid to say that Mr. Modi will not show a national vision. I'm no defender of Mr. Modi, but let's be fair. Now, I'm saying this because Mr. Modi has articulated certain positions on foreign policy and security policies. And the substance of what he is articulating is that there should not be the kind of vacillation that has been seen during the UPA period. During the UPA period, many foreign policy positions have oscillated like a pendulum.
Give me 3 instances.
I'll tell you. Take talks with Pakistan. The UPA in 2009 said straightforwardly, see the manifesto, that unless we get satisfaction on the question of terrorism, unless terrorism ceases, there will be no talks. 2 months later, the Prime Minister goes to Sharm el-Sheikh and says in the joint statement with Gilani that talks and terrorism, that talks will not be dependent on terrorism.
There has been precedent to this kind of behavior of the previous government.
I'm not talking of previous governments. I'm talking of something which you put down in your manifesto, and 2 months later you do a volte-face. And then what do you do in Thimphu? What do you do in New York last year? So you have said, you have oscillated between that talks and terrorism cannot go together, and
okay, that's on Pakistan. What are the other 2 things?
This is the main thing.
This is the main
on
thing.
Afghanistan. On Afghanistan, you sign a security agreement with them, a security partnership agreement, and then you say, when they ask you for weapons, you say, no, sorry, we will not supply you weapons. What is this?
Okay, Meera, Shankar, would you agree with that? Do you think that, these new challenges, first, as Mr. Katju says, there has been a lot of vacillation in the last 10 years about the various policies, especially in Pakistan. And would you agree with Mr. Parthasarathy that there's governments change but policies don't change so drastically?
I would tend to agree with Mr. Parthasarathy that there will be broad continuity in foreign policy because, as Vivek said, our interests are permanent and those interests have to be pursued through a variety of means, including the conduct of foreign policy. What you may see is a difference in prioritization, a difference in nuance, and let's see what they have said. Let's not impute our own analysis, but let's see what the BJP and Mr. Modi have said on some occasions. Firstly, he said that he's going to give more emphasis to economic diplomacy. And I think it's consistent with his whole agenda of development. Now, if we look at that, then I think the primary basis on which we will be able to conduct a robust economic diplomacy will also depend on our getting our own house in order. That means if we can renew growth momentum in the Indian economy and get back to 6-7% beyond, you can conduct a certain kind of foreign policy.
So are you trying to say that there would be a lot of emphasis on economic diplomacy more than other kinds of diplomacy?
Well, we have to see. This is what they have said, that they are going to give much more emphasis to economic diplomacy. We have to see how it translates into practice. The second is that they have talked of having slightly more muscular policy with Pakistan, but also emphasize that they will continue dialogue. I think Mr. Modi himself has said that they will continue dialogue. And as far as ambiguities on this issue are concerned, I mean, we've seen that with the previous government also. I think Mr. Vajpayee had Kargil and then had the Agra summit. He had Lahore, and Kargil just shortly after that. So I think these oscillations have been because I think most governments in India haven't been able to figure out, nor has the US, for instance, how exactly to deal with a nuclear-armed Pakistan.
Okay. Professor Baladas, Ghoshal, we have gone a little ahead in this discussion and so far both the panelists have been talking about presuming that there's going to be a new government, but I want you to stick to whatever be the color of the new government, what are the key foreign policy challenges which the new government will face?
I think I broadly agree with what Meera Shankar had suggested. But before I sort of talk about my own sort of ideas about foreign policy, I think there are two things I would like to reiterate. It is not so much important what people talk during the election campaigns, but what would be the result when the government comes into power.
Right.
I think there are two things are very important. One is, of course, the economic strength of a particular country, and the second point is the governance, the quality of governance. A small country like Singapore is taken seriously by a lot of people in this world, essentially because of two reasons. One is Singapore is economically quite strong, and the second is the governance is good. So I think we can talk about the nitty-gritty part of the foreign policy, but these are the two issues which are going to determine to what extent the foreign policy is going to be effective. One can take initiatives, one can take policy decisions, but the problem would be how far the others are going to take you seriously unless there are progress on the level of governance as well as in terms of economic development. Now, looking at what Modi has been talking about, if at all Modi comes into power, there may be a kind of a expectation that at least he will be more serious about, as Meera Shankar suggested, about economic diplomacy. And I think he will try to create a more business-friendly environment. And the second point also, I think during Modi's time, there could be a possibility in the improvement of governance. But at the same time, I must say that whatever we talk about our foreign policy, there are two things which people talk about, people actually criticize about our foreign policy and their effectiveness. One is the lack of a strategic vision, a long-term vision. I think most of the time what we do, we approach things like a fire brigade. It's a kind of a fire brigade approach to our foreign policy. We take ad hoc decisions. And the second problem with our foreign policy also is the implementation part of it. Ideas are not missing sometimes, but the question is implementation. And time is very important in things, and particularly in today's globalized world. And until and unless we can improve our decision-making process in terms of the implementation of whatever we promise to the rest of the world.
Okay. We are now
It will
joined
not be a very effective one.
Okay, Professor Ghoshal, I'll come back to you. We are now joined in by Manoj Joshi, a veteran journalist and a foreign policy analyst. Manoj, did the UPA government last 10 years lack a long-term vision, as Professor Ghoshal says? And then I want you to address what Mr. Katju said.
The thing is that if you look at Indian foreign policy from approximately 1991, you'll see a certain kind of a continuity. One of the aspects of it has been that we have had a continuous dialogue with Pakistan regardless of what Pakistan has done to us. There have been terrorist attacks, etc., and we have persisted in the dialogue, and every government thereafter...
Regardless of its color.
Okay. So there, as I said, there has been a continuity.
Right.
So in that sense, the UPA government followed what was put on the menu by the NDA government before that. And I think there, to a certain extent, we were obviously guided by what Vivek said. We were guided by our interests. This is something which different governments, different parties felt that these were our interests and we need to pursue those policies. Of course, it also required people of unusual caliber, for example, Atal Bihari Vajpayee. But in the case of Vajpayee, you see, we know what he was all about. He was, after all, External Affairs Minister in 1979. He made the opening to Pakistan after the 71 war. He made the opening to China after the 62 war. So we knew there was a certain
So he had a legacy which we needed to carry.
Which he had to follow. Now we are in a new era. We are at a point where, let's say with Pakistan, we are wondering whether that policy that we began in 1991, where have we ended up? meaning we have not got satisfaction on the issue of terrorism, on this very important issue of the Mumbai particularly, which has upset people in this country. Everyone is worried that what if there is another Mumbai? How do we cope with it? So many issues. So as far as Pakistan is concerned, we've reached a kind of a dead end out there. Likewise, in the case of China, we've been having talks. We've had these special representatives. They've been talking of the border issue. We've been having talks on this border thing from the 80s, virtually. And so, again, we've reached a point where we all know what the settlement has to be. Meaning, basically, it's on a kind of an as-is, where-is basis. But there is no political understanding of how that has to be pushed, particularly in India. See, Chinese being an authoritarian society, if they want, they can
push anything they want.
Our problem is, this has to be a strong leader, a leader of Vajpayee's caliber, who has to go to parliament and push the settlement. Now, these are the issues. The problem with foreign policy, is that you don't control all the variables. The others also control, meaning...
so are you trying to say that the long-term vision was lacking?
No, I'm saying that we have a fairly shrewd idea of what our interests are. Our problem is that we don't know what beyond that. For example, there was talk just now, Professor Ghoshal spoke about, there was talk about economic foreign policy.
Yes.
Now, there are two issues which we have to confront, which are outside our control. One is the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The other is the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. Now, these are two big things happening in our neighborhood, in the sense the TPP, where the US is trying to gain ascendance as an economic actor, and the regional RCEP, which China, because in association with ASEAN, can become a powerful actor. We are virtually out of. We are not even thinking about these things. We are not even.
But we are major players there in that.
We are major players, but we are not major players in the negotiation.
Okay, Mr. Parthasarathy, you want to come in very quickly.
One sentence.
Yes.
Only. I think what's been lacking in UPA 2, unlike UPA 1, is one central idea. One large idea. UPA 1, at least.
Nuclear policy was a large idea.
The nuclear policy was a large idea. In UPA 2, you see a complete
There were no large ideas. Mr. Parthasarathy?
May I say one thing, that it's all very good to talk of vision, and these are all nice statements. But the reality is, you can have a vision, or you can look far ahead when you are very clear of where you are moving in two areas. One, your economy. Two, your security. Coming to the economy.
And economy, as Manoj was pointing out, is something which is...
No, exactly.
Which you
I'm coming back to what Manoj said on both. RCEP or the Comprehensive Economic Partnership. Let me tell you, the way we have been regressing on economic reform, we can fit into neither. Right. So let us be very clear, a more open economic policy, a welcoming of investment, having the courage to invest abroad, moving ahead. We need that. That has been not prevalent in UPA 2. I saw the good beginnings of it carrying forward from what the NDA did in UPA 1. Second, security. It's all very well to say, I'm going to challenge Pakistan, I'm going to challenge China, we will fight a two-front war. Your defense budget today, thanks to economic mismanagement, is 1.74% of GDP. It is what it was before the Chinese aggression. You've never had it so low. So I think what I've liked about Mr. Modi's statement is his readiness to build an indigenous defense capability through defense industry. We have to carry it forward. I'm afraid 10 years of Mr. Antony did not happen. And then you have to bring in foreign investment and globalize your defense industry. It did not happen. So as I say, if you have very clear policies which strengthens your security, meaning you can hold your own. If there is a Mumbai attack, I can knock the hell out of Muridke. If you've got the capabilities, you don't. So with regard to China, I go along with him. We have to make up our mind. What do we want?
Okay.
Are we going back to, will China, again, things have changed. Will China come back to what Deng Xiaoping offered in 1980? I think not.
Meera Shankar, my question is, all this sounds very aggressive, very good, And that's the atmosphere which prevails in the country also today. But all this saber rattling, will it help in the?
No, I'm not saber rattling. Please don't put
I'm
words
not
in my
you.
mouth.
I'm not saying
no,
you.
no, don't put
I'm
words
not
in
saying
my
you,
mouth.
that
I did
generally-
not say. If
Generally,
you
that,
characterize
if we can
what
get
I said
back-
as saber
if we can
rattling,
get back
it
into
was not
retail,
saber rattling.
If it get back,
It was not saber rattling.
These are very
Please.
aggressive
Don't
statements.
use terms which I do. I was not aggressive. I
I'm
was
not using
realistic.
term. I'm
So-
interpreting what you said.
You're interpreting it wrongly.
Anyway, so
So
these
let
kind of
me-
things, will it help in the long run?
Let me say that at the end of the day, what we have to focus on is building our own indigenous strength. Both in economic terms as well as in security terms. And in both, there are huge weaknesses that we see at the moment. Your growth has fallen, your fiscal deficit is high, you're seen as unfriendly towards business. You've
But
had
these
a
economic,
huge...
No, but these economic problems are a global problem.
No,
Will we accept that?
well, there is a global slowdown.
Yes.
In the there is a slowdown in the global economy, but India, if you look at the global crisis when it first hit in 2008, India was able to come out of that
Right.
crisis and jump back to 8% growth pretty fast with a nominal stimulus package. It was nowhere near the kind of huge stimulus which China had. Many of the weaknesses that we are seeing in the economy today are self-generated. So I think the answer lies in addressing many of those issues, including the issue of excessive bureaucratization, of regulatory agencies run amok, each agency of government trying to do what the other agency should be doing instead of doing their own work. So there's a huge problem of decision making, of bureaucratic confidence, and of creating a climate in which actually animal spirits of business will be regenerated.
Mr. Katju?
Now, in the security field also, let me say that we haven't paid enough attention to indigenization of defense production.
Yeah, that Mr.
If
Parthasarathy
you-
mentioned that,
you know,
and there's been quite a
if
lot
you
of discussion
take a
on that in the
look,
country.
when we keep saying India has become the largest importer of arms, it's not something we should be
We should be
proud
proud of. There's no doubt about it.
And there are certainly very good systems that we are working on, but if each time we keep raising the requirement of our indigenous system, normally the practice is that you use it and you keep making incremental improvements. So there'll be an Ambassador Mark 1, Ambassador Mark 2 and so forth. But we need to put that into practice.
Mr. Katju, there's a lot of talk about indigenization of defense and FDI and things like that. There has been FDI in defense has been allowed, but we have not seen any major investments coming in at all. Why is it happening like that? We talk a lot about it. We need to get investments from outside, FDI from outside. But FDI is just not coming in.
No, I think it's not only a question of having a policy position. It's also a question of having an enabling environment where the foreign investor feels that he'll be able to do business in a manner in which he is used to all over the world. And when he sees that decision making is of the kind that it is in India, he is naturally a little apprehensive of venturing into these areas, especially when it comes to defense.
One second.
But,
Manoj, would you agree with that?
You see, it's both Partha and I were members of the Naresh Chandra task force.
Right.
And we have studied this in considerable detail. There are problems at every level. First of all, there's problem of leadership. Right at the top. Then there is higher defense management. Then there is the Ministry of Defense itself. The Ministry of Defense controls of the defense public sector units and the ordnance factories. And what they do is, they don't allow anyone else into that business.
Exactly.
Now, what they've done is, they don't provide a level playing field for our very vibrant private sector to enter, number one. Leave alone the foreign fellow. The foreign fellow gets 26% FDI, whereas when they said 49, they said maybe in a case-by-case basis. Now, the point is, India, if it has to have a flourishing defense industry, India must also become an exporter of defense products.
Right.
Because you cannot have an industry, because we just don't have a large enough army to absorb everything.
Right.
So our industry, we must also be exporters. Now, if you're exporters, you must be part of global chains. Meaning you must be component supplier, meaning just like we are doing with motor cars now, that if someone is making a steering, he's supplying it all over the world.
Right.
Or so we have to enter the global chains on that. global supply chains out there. And we have to build global coalitions of, with companies and partners and others. And there we have to create a core of our own, which will be top class with our own technology, with our own R&D.
Where are we?
We are nowhere.
We're nowhere. Mr. Parthasarathy, we're nowhere.
No, we are.
No,
listen,
yes.
no. In your
Yeah.
strategic programs, you have developed the capacity for indigenous technology,
I'm
and
not
that
so
is
sure.
No, listen.
I
that is
disagree.
that is
Listen,
that is
Sorry,
primarily
both
that
Manoj
is-
and I have studied
No,
this
that
in
is-
some
I-
length.
I
that
want
is
to come back-
primarily
One second,
due
let her finish.
No, that is primarily due to the technology denial regime which was in place.
Which was in place.
I think the fact of the matter is we have
incompetence.
one advantage over the Chinese. We have access to technology and supplies from Europe and the Americans, which the Chinese don't have. As Manoj says, one, our defense ordnance factories are a mess.
RMS.
Secondly, that unless you allow foreign investment for high-tech industries, all these are dual use. Mind you, what you're going to get in electronics, you're going to use for your telecom, you're going to use for your
No, but
communication.
Meera Shankar's point that there was a technology denial regime till very recently. That has that affected
the technology
or not?
denial regime has been eroded over the last 10 years.
I'm saying that in the areas where there was a technology denial regime,
They're
such
gone.
as your space program or your atomic
You did
energy
well.
program, you did well and you developed the indigenous technologies because there was a compulsion. Otherwise,
But here there was no compulsion.
Otherwise, our preference is always to import.
It was a question of
No,
preference.
I would like to draw your attention to this fact that, of course, the success of a foreign policy depends on economic strength and domestic coherence, institutional coherence.
Right.
But surely, it is in the immediate future, while building blocks of giving greater coherence and productivity in these areas can be put in place, but there can't be a total transformation in a period of 365 days. This is a long-term thing. And we need to put in some coherence in our foreign policy positions during this period.
Okay.
It cannot be that everything will be held in abeyance till we achieve great economic strength and till
So
we
it has to run parallel and you can't
obviously.
wait for one thing.
I'll tell you one thing.
Manoj, we need to go into a very short break now. Please keep watching. We'll come back very soon and continue the discussion. Welcome back. This is a big picture special on the elections. We are discussing the foreign policy challenges which the new government will face. Let me go to Professor Baladas Ghoshal. Professor Ghoshal, we have discussed a lot about the defense and things like that. Let's get back to the actual foreign policy challenges. My question to you is, there has been a lot of debate and discussion in this country over the last several years about how India should go about, or whether India should go about promoting democracy and protecting human rights at a global level, or should we, deal with these issues on a issue-to-issue basis. How do you see how India should go ahead on these matters in the next 5 years? Say?
Achha.
I think there is a problem there. Mr. Parthasarathy, I would like to...
Listen, let us be realistic.
Yes.
We believe in a policy of non-interference in other people's internal affairs. That has stood us well. We get along with governments of different types. Look at our neighborhood. Vietnam, is it a democracy? China, is it a democracy? You're wanting to bully Sri Lanka.
At some point of time, we were talking about this.
No, but the point is this. What did you gain out of it? If there is something like a massacre in Burundi, yes. But are you going to interfere in every little thing like the Americans do? Has it served the Americans?
Ukraine, for instance.
Yes, you can't be.
Ukraine, for
You
instance.
can't look. Nobody can be totally consistent. After all, the Americans, talking of territorial integrity,
They are the most
Ukraine,
inconsistent.
are the most inconsistent. So my point is, we have inherited this policy. All our neighbors, Saudi Arabia, are you going to talk about democracy? Can you afford to talk about democracy when you have 2.5 million Indians living there? You don't interfere in their. If they want democracy, they bring it themselves. And you shouldn't be seen to be selective. In Syria, you have different viewpoints.
Exactly.
So the best thing is that on this issue, stick to a tried and tested method of non-interference in the internal affairs of others, unless there is something of a genocide which results in a spillover of refugees into our country.
Non-interference, yes, Manoj.
No, I have a
non-interference. When we
think,
talk of non-interference, we'll have to think of Sri Lanka also and the kind of demands.
see, but the point
That's
is,
why I said if it spills into our country.
I want to take off. Partha has said half of what I think. I think another half has to be added, which is we have to understand that it is in our longer-term national interests that more and more states become democratic.
Right.
I think we should weave it into our policy. But I agree that as a matter of practical politics, you don't go around shoving democracy down someone's throat. But at the same time, let's be very clear that as far as we are concerned, the growth of democracy around the world is something which must be part of our larger vision.
Right.
And we must constantly endeavor, meaning
As the largest democracy, we have a duty towards it.
see what we did in Nepal.
Do we say we have a duty towards it?
See, when Nepal was going to be taken over, when the Maoists were fighting out there, we went in, we helped to shape a particular process. We have done that in Bangladesh. To a certain extent. So what I'm trying to say is we do have a certain role there, but this has to be a very subtle role. This is something which you cannot really play the American style. You've got to play it in the Indian style. But as I said, we must never forget that at the end of the day, our long-term goal has to be that a democratic world is a world in our interest.
I want both of you to.
I think as a pure concept in international relations, this is a myth that a democratic world will be a safer world. That's one. Second, of course, if it's in our interest to promote a democratic order in a particular state, we should do it, and do it, as Manoj rightly says, subtly. But very often it is not in our interest to do so. We are for the business of foreign policy.
As a policy also, you don't think it should be, we should have a vision, as a vision also.
The business of foreign policy is not evangelism. And even as a vision, we should not be in the evangelical business.
Meera,
Yeah, I agree with all the speakers here broadly that we should not have a proselytizing zeal about democracy, because any democratic change, really the impetus must come from within a society rather than be imposed from outside. And I think the other point to bear in mind is that in the pursuit of this ideal of democracy and human rights, all countries temper their idealism with realpolitik when it comes to protecting their interests. So if you look at the West, they don't talk about human rights or democracy in Saudi Arabia or Bahrain, but will talk about it in Syria.
Right.
So for India too, we have to be selective.
We have to be selective.
We have to be selective. But at a larger level, India has shown that it supports the idea of democracy. For instance, we are part of the UN Democracy Fund.
Right.
And I think we have taken the view that instead of being critical or proselytizing, we can facilitate this process by the power of example, because India's success as a democracy and as a developing democracy has a huge demonstration effect. Secondly, by offering training and facilitation in institution building in states in transition or states which are just incipient democracies. I think India can play a huge role there.
Okay.
So our role can be a very positive one.
Okay, Mr. Parthasarathy, I would like to come back to other issues. For instance, one of the major challenges which we will face very soon is what's going to happen in Afghanistan as the US withdraws. Where do we stand there? How do we go about things?
I think Vivek addressed that earlier. We have done a splendid job we can be proud of ever since 2001 through successive governments in the economic assistance we have given to Afghanistan. Afghanistan is, after the American withdrawal, going to face a security challenge. I've just been there. I've spoken to their political leadership. I've spoken to their military. There is an expectation from them that we will now complement our economic assistance with suitable security assistance. Yes, there are limitations, but our study does show, which we've released recently, that in collaboration with countries like Russia, which have traditionally had a military presence there. We can also, working with whatever remains of the American and NATO forces, be able to help in strengthening their defense and security arrangements. Also working with countries around to build a sort of regional architecture which ends interference.
When you, Mr. Katju, when he says countries around, when does Pakistan come in here? And will it lead to more tensions between India and Pakistan as when we start dealing with Afghanistan after the US leaves?
Look, I'm clear in my mind that with the US drawdown, Pakistan will become more active to promote its interests in Afghanistan through the instrument of the Taliban.
To Taliban?
Through the Taliban. Now,
you're foreseeing problems.
I'm foreseeing problems, yes. I hope not, but I'm foreseeing them. 2, I think the Taliban are not good news for us. 3, in order to meet this challenge, we need to strengthen the central authority of Afghanistan, and thankfully they seem to have had a reasonably good election within quotes, and that election will throw up a president who will succeed Karzai.
Right.
So I think we should do everything in our power to strengthen that authority so that it is able to meet the Taliban challenge when it comes.
How do we, Shankar, how do we ensure that the tensions between India and Pakistan doesn't rise in this process?
Well, I think we can't ensure that, but you have to work with the Afghan government to strengthen their capacities. Now, till now you've limited your role largely to economic assistance and to training in the security field. I think you may have to step it up to provide certain kinds of weapons and equipment, and also to greatly expand your training. This has to be an effort along with international partners, both the NATO and ISAF on the one hand, and Russia and other neighbors of Afghanistan on the other. The second element which Partha referred to, one is to strengthen the capacities of the Afghan government. The second, particularly the Afghan National Army and the police. The second would be to create a kind of diplomatic initiative which includes all the neighbors and the regional powers, and try to work towards guarantees of non-interference. It may not work, but it's worth a try.
Pardon my saying this is completely idealistic. Let's face it, our interests and Pakistani interests clash in Afghanistan. We've got to secure our interests.
So how do we do that? Let me get Professor Ghoshal in on this. Professor Ghoshal,
yes.
Would you agree with with the fact that in Afghanistan, India is inevitably going to face problems as far as dealing with Pakistan is concerned on this issue, and so how do we go about it?
I think it will be a difficult situation. Pakistan will definitely try to have some amount of influence in Afghanistan through the Taliban, as other speakers have also mentioned that. And whatever you try to do, I think there is going to be some kind of problem with Pakistan when it comes to Afghanistan. Now, I wanted to really go into some other issues.
Yes.
Because I think whatever you try to do with Pakistan, or for that matter China, I don't think that there is going to be much improvement, whatever you try to do in the near future. But there are two areas I think the new government can take some major initiatives, and that will bring about a real change in our approach towards the neighbors. One is Bangladesh,
right,
and the other is Myanmar.
Right.
I think in the case of Bangladesh, you have a government for the last couple of years which is quite friendly towards India and have gone out of the way to deal with some of the issues of India's concern.
Right.
But somehow we have not been able to pay back, with the kind of initiatives that were required to satisfy the Bangladeshi aspirations, particularly in the Tista waters and even on the land boundary agreement and all that. I think here is a country, I think if we can really develop a closer understanding with them by giving them certain amount of concessions on their concerns, it will make a hell of a difference in our approach towards the neighbors.
Okay.
And the second issue is Myanmar.
Right.
That even if we talk about improvement of India-Myanmar relations, I think in the last 2 years, we haven't really done much in our dealings with Myanmar that could really bring about some kind of a change, and Myanmar is very crucial in terms of our policy towards Southeast Asia
Yes.
and even towards Far East.
Okay. Manoj, this is look east policy, which we have been trying to pursue for quite some time. Do you think, as Professor Ghoshal is pointing out, both in Bangladesh and in Myanmar, we have not really done what we should have been done?
That's not a secret. I mean, say almost from 1991-92, we
Right.
began this look east policy. When you look at road construction, or when you look at various other projects, or where you look at dealing with Bangladesh, because if we had settled the Tista issue, the land boundary issue, we would have gotten transit rights through Bangladesh. That would have been a major breakthrough in our connectivity with the east. Besides that, the connectivity that we were supposed to develop between Mizoram and the whole Sitwe port is still kind of up in the sky. So our big problem has been project execution. How do we execute projects that we take up? And we find consistently that somehow or the other, whether it's our border roads or whether it is these strategic projects that we need to undertake, somehow or the other these never get done. And I think we need to find new methods. Either we get a top-class, Larsen and Toubro, top-class private sector company, tell them, here's a contract, build this road, and be done with it.
I mean, is it a problem with the contractors?
It is, in many cases, yes.
Let me tell you something. The only project for us which has been a disaster in Afghanistan is the construction of the Afghan parliament. Who is implementing it? CPWD. Let me come to Myanmar. Myanmar have offered us 1800 megawatts of electricity from a project on this river adjoining the border with Manipur. That project was taken up in 1994. 20 years later, the National Hydroelectric Power Corporation is dithering. Let's come to oil and gas. We got an oil and gas contract through diplomatic action. But the Ministry of Petroleum, through 10 years, did not realize how to take that gas into India. It went to China. Same thing as he says, the Kaladan corridor. Project implementation, if you hand it over to inefficient public sector, it is a disaster.
Mr. Katju?
No, I think let's look at this.
Because you have done some work, a lot of work in Afghanistan.
Well,
did you really depend on private contractors or the public sector?
I'll need a minute.
Yeah, please.
Of your time, to examine this. In Afghanistan, the Zaran's Dilaram road was constructed by the border roads people, and they've done a good job under fairly difficult circumstances. I do not believe that a private Indian contractor had the wherewithal to really do that road. Only the BRO could do it. Now, point 2. The difficulty is that we have these organizations, CPWD, etc., who are not trained to do projects abroad. So what we've got to really first of all...
Do they get mixed up in bureaucracies? And
No, they get mixed up in bureaucracies within India.
Within India.
Now, this is difficult in itself.
Yes.
When they go abroad, they have no clue of how to handle it. They are simply not trained for this. So what we need to put in position are private sector companies and public sector companies that will eventually be able to undertake this work. I think the point Mr. Parthasarathy makes is entirely valid, that these are inefficient companies. But I'm afraid at the moment these are the only companies you have.
Okay.
And so you've got to really now begin a process of training and equipping them for this purpose.
Okay, I think we are running out of time. So there's one more very important thing. Nuclear policy, Meera Shankar, nuclear policy, there's a lot of problem. Indo-US policy and also the nuclear issue. do you think, where is it going? How should the new government take this forward? Because in the last few months at least, there has been, the Indo-US relations has taken a nosedive. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I would say the India-US relationship has been badly affected because there doesn't seem to be, pursuit of the larger picture on both sides, and smaller issues, be they of trade disputes or of disputes over diplomatic personnel, a la Ms. Khobragade and maids, have tended to dominate the relationship in the absence of leadership to give a strategic thrust to the relationship. On the nuclear issue with the US, I think the main problem has been the nuclear liability law, because the US companies felt that this was something which was against the existing international practice, and B, that it would be commercially unviable for them, because the insurance costs of unlimited liability would be unmanageable.
So, but we have passed a nuclear liability law.
Yes, we passed it. But what India did do after that, on the basis of discussions and, to try to find a way forward, we signed the, Convention on Supplementary Compensation, which is an international convention. B, we have also adopted the nuclear rules, which actually specify and cap nuclear liability of the supplier. And then I think there's also this aspect that it says, it's discretionary, that the government, that these, the companies may have recourse. So it's a question of whether in the contract there could be certain agreements between the two companies. Anyway, I think that there is a framework in place on the basis of which we could carry this dialogue forward pragmatically without either side getting tied to rhetoric. And we have an early works agreement which we have signed with Westinghouse. I think there are two other problems that would arise on the nuclear issue with the US. One is, how do we ensure price benchmarks when these are negotiated bids? How do we ensure that prices are competitive? And that is going to be quite a challenge. And the second would be, that in the US itself, some of the major companies like GE or even Westinghouse, they have been bought over by Japanese companies. And some of them, not Westinghouse, because the nuclear part of the business is in the US, the conventional part in Japan, but some of the other companies may require Japanese permission to actually proceed with India. So that would be contingent on an Indo-Japan agreement.
Manoj, a new government comes in place. Indo-US relationship is at its lowest for a long time. And, if this talk about a particular person becoming the Prime Minister who himself is having problems with the United States, how will this work out?
Well, you see, first of all, it takes two to clap. Now, I think that Mr. Modi is not going to be, put out by the fact that they denied him a visa all these years. That's not going to be the thing that's going to drive his US policy. My bigger worry is the United States itself, meaning that is President Obama, his team.
Yeah, that's what I want you to look at it from the US point of view.
You see, I think from their point of view, what has happened is they seem to have lost the plot. Meaning, if you look at Secretary of State Kerry, he's kind of focused on the Israel-Palestine issue. He's even neglecting the so-called Asian pivot, meaning we are not having much action there. American foreign policy seems to be in disarray because their president has been weakened, meaning the infighting within the Congress, the Republican and the Democrat. What has happened is that has kind of made Obama into a lame duck president much too early. Meaning, though we have elections this November, the off-year election will take place, but actually it is expected that the Republicans will do very well. And if that is the case, I don't foresee much, I don't expect much from this particular administration and this team, meaning Kerry and Obama.
Mr. Parthasarathy?
I broadly agree with him.
Yeah.
I don't expect much from the Obama.
So Indo-US relations are going to be in a bind for some time.
No, there are things we can do. I think many of these trade disputes can be resolved. I think the moment our economy picks up momentum, And we should be really open
No,
about
but Mr. Parthasarathy, my question is, will US see India in the same light as it is seeing now, or will it see differently when the color of the government changes in India?
I don't think the color of the government is going to matter. Whatever their past views and perspectives about in case Mr. Modi comes to power. But the fact of the matter is that there are real issues with them and they need to be tackled, most importantly in the economic area. In regard to the political area, I go along with Manoj. After Secretary of State Clinton and Robert Gates, the Defense Secretary, left, we have two incumbents, one of whom is apathetic towards India, which is the Defense Secretary, and I would rate Kerry as being not friendly towards India.
Meera Shankar, very quickly.
I would also agree that I don't think that the color of the government in India will have an impact on US policy towards India, because I think India is too important and pragmatically they would like to deal with whichever government is there. I do also agree that the Obama administration in its second term has lost the thread as far as India is concerned.
So you can compare it with UPA 2 actually. Obama
Yes.
2 and UPA 2.
And UPA 2. Yes, both in a sense were consumed by their domestic insecurities and vulnerabilities and crises. But I think that there is a lack of clarity on the part of the US, how it views India right now, where it sees it fit in its overall vision of Asia. And I think that it's important that,
so that would be a real challenge
US,
for India to deal with them.
India as well, but also for the United States, because
Absolutely.
they need a country like India.
Professor Ghoshal, very quickly.
Yes. Your title of your program is Big Picture.
Yes.
But I look at it from the small picture. You see, the thing is that United States, Russia, China, the relations are not going to improve or deteriorate to that extent that might affect us. I think we should begin from a small picture with our neighbors. And if we could really manage our neighbors, there is going to be a big change in our approach towards the world. And I think the neighbors will also look at us from a different perspective.
Yeah, very quickly, last word, sir.
I think the United States is giving us low priority. However, a new government coming in, whatever, maybe it's you, will be an opportunity for not only the United States, but for the rest of the world to look at India and look at it seriously.
In a fresh perspective.
In a fresh perspective, and that gives us opportunities to put correctives in place where they are seriously needed.
Okay, sir. I think on that note, we need to end. It has been a very interesting discussion. Hopefully, the new government will take all these suggestions and comments, and hopefully we will see a new perspective coming into our foreign policy. Thanks to all my guests, Mr. G. Parthasarathy, Meera Shankar, Vivek, Katju, Manoj, Joshi, and Professor Baladas, Ghoshal. Please keep watching. We'll come back with another issue on this special Big Picture next week.